Good evening and welcome to the annual Morehouse College Martin Luther King Jr. Lecture and Conversation Series. I am Vicki Crawford, the director of the office that has oversight for the Morehouse King Collection. The collection consists of over 13,000 items, many of them iconic sermons and speeches and correspondence with world leaders. We're so happy to have you here with us this evening. We come together amidst unprecedented times, a pernicious and growing pandemic, real and continuing threats to our democracy, and the loss of young Black lives, as we've seen this summer, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, among others. Here in Georgia, though, there has been a glimmer of hope. We've elected the first African American to the United States Senate, a Morehouse man, Reverend Raphael Warnock, along with John Ossoff. The presidential administration has now transitioned, and in another historical first, we've elected Kamala Harris as the first woman of color to hold the second highest office in the United States. But there's much work left ahead. The theme for our panel this evening is taken from Dr. King's 1967 book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. This book is particularly prophetically contemporary for us in its insight and analysis of all the various forms of interlocking oppression. So joining us this evening are our panelists. First, Bishop William J. Barber II, co-founder of the Poor People's Campaign. He's also pastor of the Greenleaf Christian Church in Goldsboro, North Carolina, and was the key leader of the Moral Monday protest at the North Carolina General Assembly in 2013. Also with us is Dr. Barber's co-founder of the Poor People's Campaign, Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis. Dr. Theoharis teaches at the Union Theological Seminary in New York City, where she currently is also director of the Kairos Center for Religions, Rights, and Social Justice. She is also an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church, USA. Next, a Morehouse graduate, Reverend Dr. Otis Moss III joins us from Chicago, where he is the senior pastor of Trinity United Church of Christ. Reverend Dr. Moss is a nationally recognized minister who has spent the past 2 decades of his life preaching a theology of Black resistance that calls attention to injustices such as mass incarceration and economic inequality. We also have a Morehouse College student with us this evening, Mr. Joseph Ramirez, who is a sophomore majoring in business administration with a concentration in finance. Mr. Ramirez is a student activist and a King Legacy Scholar. And finally, our moderator is Dr. David Wall Rice, professor of psychology and an expert on social justice and activism in sports. Following this next short video, I will turn the program over to Dr. Rice for the discussion.
A powerful new movement is rising across America. From the Mississippi Delta to the Apache stronghold, from the homeless encampments of Washington to the coal fields of West Virginia. We are the 140 million poor and low-wealth people in this country, and we are building the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival.
On June 20th, between the primaries and the general election, we will rise together for the mass Poor People's Assembly and Moral March on Washington, a digital justice gathering.
Our nation is at a historic crossroads. There are those who say big change isn't necessary or possible, that we are powerless to make our lives better.
But history teaches us that it is exactly in times like these that people from all walks of life must build a broad and deep movement from the bottom up.
On June 20th, we will come together to lift the voices and faces of poverty in the midst of pandemic for a massive, historic online gathering that will embolden us, strengthen us, and prepare us to fight for the kind of society we know we so badly need and deserve.
Rise with us. Visit June2020.org.
Hello, my name is David Wall Rice. I'm professor of psychology at Morehouse College, where I'm also the head of the Identity, Art, and Democracy Lab. It is a privilege and an honor to be with you all this evening on the occasion of the celebration of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s life and legacy. Thank you all for joining us tonight, and most importantly, thank you for your freedom work that certainly demonstrates as an echo of the freedom work that Dr. King championed. What we'll do here tonight is at once simple and profound. We'll be in conversation, but of course, we will be in conversation with intentionality and with freedom work placed at center. So the design is for us to share with one another, you all, of course, sharing your thinking, your feeling, and doing, so that those who engage us virtually will have a template for how they are indeed able to be freedom fighters, if not in the popularly celebrated sense of the construct, in the sense that they can be radically free by loving themselves and by holding those they encounter accountable by demanding that they respect that self love. So, with that, I won't have too much more preamble. Dr. Barber, I would hope that you would start us off with opening remarks about your activism and agitation towards social justice, followed by Dr. Moss and then Dr. Theoharis. Please, so Dr. Barber.
Well, thank you so much for having me on today. And I love that idea of identity and art. In the sense, the movement for justice and love is about what kind of identity we will have as a nation and as a people. And there's a certain artisticness to movement building. I'm currently the president of the Carers of the Breach, which is the co-sponsor of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. My national co-chair is Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis. And within that area, we focus on what we call the breaches, the gaps, the areas in our society where there are gaps between who we say we are, who we claim to be, and who we actually are. And we do it by looking very intently and intentionally and extensively at policy and the impact of policy and the impact in people's lives. One of the things, there was a report done not recently by the United Nations about poverty in this country and other areas that are impacted by poverty. And they said something very profound. We have all the resources that we need to address the issue, but we do not have the will. That's the psychosis of our nation. And they said, and the only way we can have the will is for there to be a mass movement of poor and impacted people, moral leaders, and advocates from every spectrum and every aspect of this society to be engaged. That is what we're doing with the Carers of the Breach. That is what we're doing with the Poor People's Campaign. And I look forward to further dialogue today about the work of the campaign, the agenda, and why it's so important in this particular moment.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Dr. Moss, can you share with us a little bit, please?
Sure. Thank you. I'm just first delighted to be a part of the conversation with all of you. And it's good to see my brother, none other than Reverend William Barber, who did a tremendous job at the National Cathedral. We are very, very, very proud of you and your work. I serve at Trinity United Church of Christ in Chicago, Illinois. We are a church that lives out liberation theology. One of our mottos is that we are unashamedly Black, unapologetically Christian. And we have been committed in several areas. One, to the dismantling of mass incarceration. Two, economic empowerment and environmental justice. And we're currently very excited that we've been in a fight for quite some time with state legislatures and the governor, but we have a new governor now, where we were able to end the money bail bond system in Illinois. Wonderful coalition of organizations all across the state. It's one of the second victories, I should say. One of the previous ones that led to this is that we ended the box. We called it ban the box, where you would have to mark that you are a person out of the incarceration movement. And we have been a congregation that is intentionally focused on transforming a section in the south side of Chicago through health, education, and economic empowerment, and bringing the environmental movement to the south side of Chicago. And we have been very excited about some of the victories that we have witnessed in Chicago, especially on the far south side where we reside. And we have been connected with the Black Lives Matter movement, supporting them not only financially, but in terms of boots on the ground. And that is part and parcel of our theology, that we believe in lived theology and not just preached theology. And I'm proud to say that we have been supporters of Repairs of the Breach, the campaign for the third reconstruction that our brother, William Barber, has been leading all across this country.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rice. It's an honor to be with everyone today. My name is Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis. I'm the director of the Cairo Center for Religions, Rights, and Social Justice at Union Theological Seminary and co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. Our Poor People's Campaign is organizing across the country, and we're in 45 states, mobilizing, organizing, registering people for a movement, and educating ourselves for how we are building power, how we're shifting the narrative, and how we're putting forward the needs and the demands of 140 million poor and low-income people in the richest nation in human history. We're in a moment where change is possible and change is necessary. The Poor People's Campaign has put forward 14 policy priorities for the first 100 days of the Biden-Harris administration. We see these priorities as constitutionally consistent, morally defensible, and economically sane. They come actually out of the lives, out of the struggles, out of the powerful agency, out of the powerful insights of 140 million people who are poor, or one storm, one emergency, one fire, one healthcare crisis, one job loss from economic ruin. Our priorities are about embodying a politics of love, of justice, of truth. And we know that we can actually reconstruct society in the way that we're talking about here. We have a restoration agenda. And in fact, it's costing our society more to have the level of poverty than it would be for us to address it in the first place. And so we need comprehensive COVID relief. We need guaranteed health care for all. We need to raise the minimum wage. We need to update the poverty measure. We need guaranteed quality housing. We need a federal jobs program. We need to protect and expand voting rights and civil rights. We have to guarantee safe and equitable public education. We need just immigration reform. We have to ensure the rights of all Indigenous people. We have to enact fair taxes and targeted tax credits. We have to redirect this bloated Pentagon budget towards actually these priorities, which is a matter of national security. And we need poor and low-income people and their allies and advocates and moral leaders to come forward and be able to establish a permanent council to be advocating for this bold agenda. And so, it's so important for us to have this conversation here today, because again, we're building, we're organizing, and we're going to make sure that we lift everybody up from the bottom so our society can rise.
Thank you so much for that. And with that as a bit of a segue, Dr. Barber, can you educate us just a little bit more about the Poor People's Campaign? Of course, you gave us an overview, but what does that mean? And we know of its connection to the legacy of Dr. King, but how have you pushed that forward, and how is it that you are standing in the gap, or having masses of people stand in the gap for those whose voices are oftentimes marginalized and unheard? Can you just educate us a little bit more about that?
Sure. And let me also say that I'm an active pastor as well, like my dear brother, Reverend Dr. Moss. And that is something that we hold uniquely. We are pastors who we not only are engaged in these issues, but we pastor the people that are impacted by the injustices, which keeps us centered, keeps us focused, keeps us steady. The Poor People's Campaign, the relaunch, a national call for a moral revival, we relaunched in 2017. We announced it on Watch Night 2016, right after the election of Donald Trump. But we didn't do it because of Donald Trump. We did it because we had done 26 national moral revival tours, state tours around the country prior to that. And people were saying we need a renewal of a moral movement regardless of who got elected. And then in 2017, we did an analysis. One of the things we recognized was that the original Poor People's Campaign, while popular history tells us it was Dr. King, was actually the welfare rights women who went to Dr. King and said, we have to have this movement. And then it was joined by indigenous people and Latinos and the Jewish Federation. And it was a whole lot of people. In fact, when Dr. King started the Poor People's Campaign, he was actually going down in the polls. And he had been dismissed by newspapers, black and white, civil rights organizations that come out against him because he said there were three interlocking injustices of racism, militarism, and poverty. In 2017, we asked the question of some scholars and economists and others, give us, what is the state of the souls of poor folk 50 years after the Poor People's Campaign? And this is what they told us. They told us that we still have to deal with systemic racism, we mean policy racism, but not just in how it affects black people. The racism toward black people, indigenous people, Latino people, other people of color who are immigrants, and even the collateral damage of racism towards white people and how racism is in fact an attack on humanity and democracy, even though it's targeted at black and brown people. Secondly, we did some data on poverty, and we found out 50 years later, there are 140 million poor and low-wealth people in this country, and 250,000 people were dying a year from poverty, 700 people a day. But we had been hearing there was 40 million poor people, but the actual numbers said 140 million poor and low wealthy. 61% of all black people are poor and low wealth. Then we looked at ecological devastation. We found that there are 4 million families that get up every morning and buy unleaded gas, can't buy unleaded water. Then we looked at healthcare denial. We found out there were 89 million people in this country, uninsured or uninsured, and we're the only of the so-called industrialized countries that attaches healthcare to people's jobs and not their humanity in their body. Then we looked at the war economy, and the war economy, we found out that we spend $800 billion a year on war, the war economy. That's more than Russia, Iraq, Iran, North Korea, and China combined. But it's 54 cents of every discretionary dollar going to the war economy and less than 16 cents going to education, infrastructure, and healthcare. And then finally, we looked at the false moral narrative of religious nationalism that has become so engrossed with our public policy and is teaching and pushing that basically a godly agenda is being against gay people, being against abortion, being for tax cuts, suggesting that Jesus is a founding member of the NRA, if you will, and voting Republican. And what we saw is that we had to add to those three evils: ecological devastation, healthcare, denial of healthcare, and the false moral narrative of religious nationalism, that these 5 interlocking injustices were destroying and could be the destruction of this democracy, and that only poor and low wealth people leading with them and moral leaders. So now, lastly, we have 43 coordinating committees across this country, including Washington, D.C. We launched in 2018 with a massive 6 weeks of nonviolent civil disobedience in 41 states and the District of Columbia. And by the way, when we went into the Capitol, they arrested us while we were just praying and trying to deliver an agenda. I mean, arrested like 5,000 people. And then we also have a moral jubilee agenda. We put together a moral budget done with some of the best economists using this theme, and I'll stop here. Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Peace Prize economist, puts it like this. He says, the question is not how much does it cost, will it cost America to deal with inequality, but how much does it cost us not to? And so we've organized in all these states from Alabama to Appalachia, bringing white Kansas farmers together with black folk who are fast food workers. Last year on June 20th, we had planned to have a mass poor people center. Dr. Otis Moss was a part of it. We were going to be in Washington, D.C., showing that we believe you got to change the narrative around these issues and build power and offer an agenda. We couldn't do it because of COVID, so we went online. 2.7 million people showed up saying that we must address these 5 interlocking injustices. And notice that, because we believe in fusion coalitions, you address the interlocking injustices together. It's not about winning one or the other. They have to be addressed together because they are fundamental threats to who we are and our identity as a nation and the lives of people who are suffering in this country.
So, Dr. Barber, with the information that you provided for us, it seems like it's so obvious for us to be on the side of morality and, I dare say, of righteousness. Why is it that we are in a space within the context of the United States to where we are immoral, where there has to be a call for, a moral renewal? You talked about earlier that we have the capacity. You talked earlier about we have the capacity, but we don't have the will.
Well, we spent a lot of.
Why is that? I mean, why is that the case?
Well, it's a multiplicity of reasons. One is that we've spent a lot of time killing our conscience in this country. All the people that called us the conscience, like Dr. King and others, were either killed or marginalized. Let's be honest about that. And when a country constantly kills its prophets, it's going to struggle with moving forward. Secondly, we also know that there's been a deliberate attempt after the Poor People's Campaign and the war on poverty to remove poverty from our political conversation, and racism too. But poverty, think about the last time you heard a debate at the presidential level on poverty and dealing with poverty and low wealth, or at the senatorial level, or at the governor's level. We tend to have Republicans who racialize poverty, make it people's personal faults, and then it's Black and brown people and indigenous people. But then we have Democrats too often that run from poverty. They won't even say the word. And if you don't say the word, if you don't talk about the issue, then you'll never address the issue. The third thing is, remember your graduate, Dr. King, said in 1965, at the end of the Selma to Montgomery March, he said, every time there is a possibility for the Negro masses and the white masses to come together and build a just society, he said the aristocracy deliberately sows division. He said, and he was talking about the first Reconstruction, but he was applying it to the civil rights movement. He said they deliberately sowed division. So think about all of the division way before Trump. What we've had since '68, it was Richard Nixon, Pat Buchanan, Kevin Phillips. They came up with an idea to protect corporate greed and to hold on to power. They would deliberately split the nation. They would create something they call positive polarization. And they would sow and feed division, particularly in the South, where 1/3 of all poor people live in the South, 1/3 of all poor white people live in the South. And so we have to understand that the divisions that we sing to hold on to corporate power and greed, and to guarantee that we give more tax breaks to the wealthy than uplift to poor and low-wealth people, is a deliberate design that comes from the corporate suites, the political spaces, and even pulpits in this country. Let me give you one modern example. We're in the middle of a pandemic. The first CARES Act that we passed last year, 84% of the money went to corporations and banks. Think about that. We gave service workers, that's what they were before COVID. We changed their name to essential workers, but we didn't provide them the essential living wages they need, and mortgage protections, and moratoriums on their rent, and moratoriums on lights and water being cut off. Right now, if we raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour, which, by the way, was the agenda of the March on Washington. The March on Washington had 2 things on the agenda, more than 2, but these 2 specifically: a Civil Rights Act and a $2 minimum wage, which looked at and increased to now would be $15 an hour. If we did that, it would raise 62 million people up out of poverty, and 39 million families, and pump billions of dollars into the economy. Why is it that we don't do that? Because the corporate elites, look at what happened in Georgia. It was corporate elites running for the Senate who were calling healthcare and living wages socialism and radicalism. So we have this problem in this nation where the corporate elites and the political elites deliberately sow division to keep us from reaching and challenging these issues. And then if you have Democrats run from these issues, then what you get is stalemate. So what we have to have is a movement built on the agency of poor and low wealth people with moral leaders and advocates and economists and others that will change this dynamic. And that's what our goal is in the movement.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Moss, I want to take some of what it is that Dr. Barber has offered to us and link it with what you talked about when you first came and spoke with us about this lived theology and talking about also liberation theology. Can you give us a little bit of a primer of what liberation theology is, and how is it that allows us to be able to look at a true democracy and the types of freedoms that we all want to touch, feel, and experience?
Yeah, absolutely, Dr. Rice. Well, to borrow from Morehouse graduate Howard Thurman, when he speaks in Jesus and Disinherited, it speaks about those who have their backs against the wall. What is unique about the African-American religious tradition, Black religiosity, Black spirituality, or the Black church tradition, not the Black church, but the tradition of the Black church, is that inherent within our theology, we do not practice the same theological narrative of white evangelicals. I heard one elder put it this way: there are those who had a theology who stood on the deck of the slave ship. And then there was an embedded theology of those who were in the hull, that they were worshiping two different gods. And so liberation theology raises questions for the most vulnerable. Liberation theology speaks for those who have their backs against the wall. It, one, sees no separation between sacred and secular. That is very West African. The idea that you don't separate, as you do in the Western tradition, all of these different disciplines. They work together. Your life is an embodiment of your faith versus just what you say. But it's what you say, it's what you do, it's what you think, it's how you practice. The second piece is the inherent worth and dignity of all human beings, that everybody has the imprint of the divine upon them. The third piece is the recognition that racism, the racial caste, white supremacy is a sin. Western theological narratives always want to make things personal, but do not want to engage what is happening publicly. That's what Reverend Barber is doing. He recognizes the idea that racism, that poverty, the structure, the systems that we put in place, human systems, are destructive to the human personality. And so racism in itself becomes a sin. So a faith or a tradition that cannot raise a question about a social construction known as race or racism or white supremacy or racial caste is not in itself doing the work that Black religiosity, Black spirituality, the Black church tradition has called us to do. I like to put it this way, that much of the faith tradition, or I don't even want to use the faith tradition in this term, much of Christianity in America is not Christianity, but simply capitalism with Christian garments. It is the practicing of exploitation and ideology, and white supremacy becomes the idolatry or the ideology and the altar by which capitalism is practiced. So racial caste and economic exploitation work together in order to protect the 1%, and as Dr. Barber said, to sow division between those who do not find themselves in the upper class. To go further in reference to this idea is that if you look in the 1700s, in the 1600s, the idea of seeing Black people as a separate racial caste was not embedded in American ideology. It was really after the Bacon Rebellion in Virginia that you then have this caste idea this racial ideology that becomes embedded, that there's a strong difference racially between individuals. Prior to that, people who were African ethnically, not racially. White people were ethnic. They were not white. They were, are you Irish? Are you Scottish? They were raising questions of ethnicity. But then comes the racial caste, where then all of a sudden they are given a wage. The wage is privilege, and the separation between creating coalition to point to the individual or group, the plutocrats who are really controlling systems in America. So liberation theology literally deconstructs this idea and seeks to liberate people from this American original sin known as race.
So, Dr. Theoharis, can you talk to us a little bit more about the Poor People's Campaign and specifically kind of how it evolved? We know again of Dr. King's relationship to the Poor People's Campaign shortly before his assassination. Can you talk to us about the tactics that have remained the same, and again how it is that things might have evolved, or how it is that you've adjusted to present times in terms of fighting off these evils?
We're organized in 45 states across the country, and we have local coordinating committees in each of those states, made up of poor and low-income people, made up of moral leaders and clergy, activists, advocates, organizers, across a great diversity. Those coordinating committees are organizing on a state level, and what we say is that we're nationalizing state-based movements. And we're coming together and organizing the power of the 140 million people who are poor, or one storm, one emergency away from deep poverty. We have been deeply inspired by the 1967 and 1968 Poor People's Campaign that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, with the Welfare Rights Union, with many different leaders of the time, really launched and called for. But we have done some things that are a little bit different. What Dr. King talked about when he called for the campaign was to bring poor people from across different poor communities into Washington, D.C. and to stay there until the demands had been met. We've seen that, over the past more than 50 years, so many of the policies that are causing havoc and wreaking havoc in people's lives are policies that are happening on a state-based level. And so much of our movement is actually focused on organizing the power of people in the states across this country, and then coming together to work on nationally coordinated activities. So in 2018, we launched with this wave of nonviolent civil disobedience. In 2019, we had the first ever Poor People's Moral Action Congress, and we testified to a House Budget Committee. We presented our Poor People's Moral Budget. In 2020, we had plans to have a massive in-person Mass Poor People's Assembly and Moral March on Washington. We had to move that online because of COVID and because of the public health experts that work with us advising that we couldn't gather in person. But we had more than 3 million people join us for the largest social media gathering of poor and low-income people in this country's history, where we got to hear the stories and the solutions coming out of people's lives. And in the 2020 election, we mobilized millions of people, of voters, of eligible voters, to be able to organize and vote around an agenda that prioritizes the poor, that talks about living wages and healthcare. And our work is to keep on building, keep on organizing, and build up, really a force that Dr. King talked about would be powerful to make the powers that be say yes to healthcare, say yes to living wages, say yes to equitable schools, and when they may be desirous of saying no. And so our work is surely inspired and modeled after the work that folks were doing more than 50 years ago. But we would need a Poor People's Campaign today, even if they hadn't launched one then. And we would need to be organizing, uniting people across all of our differences in states across the country in order to be a powerful moral movement from below.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Moss, how is it that white folks are to respond to this Black liberation theology? Or white folks to say, oh, I want to be a practicing Black liberation theology? How do they respond, and then what does it look like?
Well, I'll go in reverse in that if the way that white people must respond is they must interrogate their whiteness and also cast aside or exercise their whiteness. It's an interesting thing. I heard Jim Wallace put it this way. He said, when I'm in America, I'm white, but when I land in Europe, they ask me, what ethnicity am I? And for most white people, they're only white when Black folk are in the room. Once we leave, they begin to talk about their German heritage and their French heritage and their Scottish heritage. We enter the room, and then unknowingly privilege then becomes into the question. So there has to be an interrogation of this idea of whiteness and the privilege that is subconscious in terms of how people function. The way that it is lived out is that we begin to create the kind of institutions, villages, communities, structures, and policies that allow people to flourish at their highest human capacity, the way in which God intends it. So I'll give you a prime example that here in Chicago, one of the things that we have been doing is that we have been attacking food swamps and food deserts, which essentially is food apartheid, by building gardens and also creating farmers markets, but not just bringing farmers in. We want to use African-American farmers who have been shut out from bringing their produce to large institutions such as a Walmart or a Kroger or any other particular institution, and build a farmers market. What does that do? A farmers market and a garden, all of the research that we've done in Chicago, you lower the violence rate in a community just when you have a garden, just when you have a farmer's market. Why? Because it builds community, it builds relationships, and all of a sudden creates something that the way in which we structure cities does damage to. So that's one area. Another area is in reference to healthcare. So we recognize that there is also a healthcare challenge in our neighborhood. So we partnered with one of the largest healthcare providers in the city, and we built a full service medical center, not a clinic, not a free clinic, but a full service medical center that is run by 4 brilliant African-American women, several of them graduates of HBCUs, I might also add. Another piece was when we decided to do community development work, our library, the Carter G. Woodson Library, was falling apart. Has the largest collection of African-American literature in the Midwest, but it was falling apart. If you are doing a dissertation, Dr. Rice, you're doing a paper, and you need to do a paper, and you need some firsthand resources on Gwendolyn Brooks, you have to go to this particular library. Mm-hmm. And so we pushed the city to renovate the library. We organized in the community because our community deserves a great library. We didn't think anybody would be against the library. Nobody hates on the library. And what we found is that the city said, we don't have any money. So what we did is on a Sunday morning, I stood up in church. I said, finished the message and whatnot. And I just announced, I said, by the way, there is a library commission meeting. We'd like for you all just to show up because they're saying that there's no money for us to renovate the library. Well, about 400 or so folks showed up at the library commission meeting. Nobody shows up at a library commission meeting. Nobody. I mean, literally nobody. It's just boring. They just deal with the Dewey Decimal System or something. I don't know, but it's just completely boring. Within 10 minutes after the meeting, I received a call from the commissioner saying that they wanted to sit down with the coalition to discuss how we can deal with the library. They said, we found the money. They found the money in 10 minutes. It was fascinating to me. They found the money, $10 million, to renovate the library. And they said, we've got everything taken care of. We're going to renovate it. You're getting what you want. And we said, no, we're not getting what we want. We want to make sure that the contractors are contractors from this neighborhood, and you are hiring individuals who are coming out of the mass incarceration system, and that the building is designed with an environmental and sustainable framework. They looked back at us and said, this has never been done before. We said, well, we did it with our church. And the argument was, we gave them the papers and the information on how we renovated our church and how we use the same model of development. I said, if an institution like a church can do it, then the resources of a city or a county should be able to do the same thing. You can't say you can't do it. You've got to have some prophetic imagination. So I'm happy to say that we renovated this particular library, which is an anchor in our community. We got a clinic down the street. We have housing that we're about to go up, and we have been buying old homes that have been delinquent on the tax records, and renovating them and selling them in our community so people can move back in, so we can have not gentrification, but a renaissance in our neighborhood. That's what it looks like. It's not rocket science. It's just very basic things to ensure that people are able to live to their fullest human capacity.
So Dr. Theoharis, over the past several weeks in particular, we've seen the rise of kind of white Christian nationalism. Can you talk to us about what that means with respect to threats on democracy and the role of the Poor People's Campaign and the progressive church and faith-based organizations in terms of how it is that they push that back and right set injustice to justice?
So indeed, we saw a horrific act of violence, against our democracy that was surely emboldened by the president, senators, and representatives, and all of those enablers who have been really beating the drums of white supremacy and systemic racism for so long. But what we also saw at the Capitol isn't altogether new. This kind of mob violence has risen at all points in U.S. history when the possibility for change from below to really take place, and we must see how it is actually in response to the election of the first Jewish and the first Black senators from Georgia, with record turnout of people of color and poor and low income folk across the state. What we have seen, again, also didn't just come out of nowhere. We've seen the rise of a white evangelical religious nationalism, Christian nationalism, growing in its power and in its influence over decades now. And for sure, it was particularly emboldened by the president. But again, it kind of follows, what's happened throughout history, where there have been these kind of theological battles, these battles over the Bible, and where forces of regression have reached back and tried to fan the flames of division, of white supremacy, and tried to divide people who are in fact actually trying to come together and organize for justice for all. So what this means is that we have to, including myself and others that are pastors and Christians in this work, and people of all faiths and people not of faith, must see that what's really at the heart and center of our religious traditions is the desire and the will to do justice. If you cut the word poverty, if you cut the word justice, if you cut all of the programs to lift people up, whether it's the lepers or women or marginalized groups throughout the Bible, the whole Bible falls apart. And so instead, we have these emboldened Christian nationalists, these white evangelicals. But the word evangelical actually comes from the Greek evangelion, which means good news. And it's always put in our Bibles connected to good news to the poor. It's a very material, it's a very real message of justice, of liberation, of prosperity for the whole community, everybody and nobody out. And that is the message that we must be hearing in this moment. Not the message of hate, not the message of exclusion, not the message of violence, and surely not the idea that any group is particularly better, that racism is okay, or that white supremacy has any validity in our society. And so what we must do is keep on organizing, but it needs to unite a moral movement from the bottom up, that has, at its core, at its center, this message, the sacred message that everybody's got a right to live, which means that Black lives matter. That means that Native lives matter. It means that poor lives matter, and that it means that we all must actually have a real repentance and a real turning around, especially those in power, those Christian leaders, those white Christian leaders who have been preaching heresy and anathema, and we need to turn this ship around and make this nation and make this world what it can be and what God wants it to be for everybody, which means starting from those that have been marginalized, those that have been victims of police violence, those that have been on the other end of racism, and those who are a part of the 140 million people who are poor and low income.
I love that. Thank you. So I want to pause now and ask Joseph Ramirez if we can bring him in to be in conversation, and then we'll come back and have a little bit of a joint dialogue and as we conclude.
Reverend Dr. Otis Moss III, 2020 was more than just the year of clear vision. We saw, heard, and felt the true definition of hatred. And now we will have stories, faces, and names of people like Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Daniel Prude, and too many others forever ingrained in our minds. Then as we began 2021, we saw that hatred manifest itself into a physical attack on the Capitol that resulted in no repercussions. In light of all this, the question that I pose to you is, where do HBCUs and Morehouse College in specific go from here? And what role can both individuals and institutions play in combating injustice as it stares us in the face?
What a tremendous question. And I thank you for it. And I'm also thank you that you made a choice to attend the greatest college on the planet, none other than Morehouse College. Historically Black colleges are at a crossroads. We are right at the crossroads because we cannot imitate white institutions. Morehouse's role is not to produce men who can simply service white institutions or to operate within the framework of the idolatry of white supremacy. Morehouse has always produced men who have actually been making America, not to make it great again, but to try and live up to the promises that Sister Gorman at the inauguration was talking about. So it is incumbent upon HBCUs to build servant leadership models that produce individuals to serve not only the most vulnerable, but to serve our community. It is through HBCUs that America saw a second Reconstruction. The student-led movement in North Carolina and in Atlanta, that's HBCU. The student-led movement in Nashville, that's HBCU work. The student movement in Mississippi, that's HBCU work. We need to have the kind of curriculum that is not designed for people to work for a white corporation, but the kind of curriculum that will help people develop their moral compass along with the necessary disciplines to deepen their academic pursuits, but also nurture their spirit. It's not enough if we cannot say we are the Harvard of the South. We have to have the perspective that that is too low of a bar. We have to create and imagine an institution that is developing individuals who can serve the world with a moral compass.
I will tease my dear brother, Dr. Otis Moss, that I will give him Morehouse the greatest private HBCU. North Carolina Central is the greatest public NCCU. I mean,
That's good. That's good.
You all Maynard Jackson, and I could go down the line because the law school we had long before. But anyway, I think you're exactly right. The role of the HBCU and the role of the Black College. We used to have something called Black College Day when I was an undergrad student. We actually marched on the Capitol and met with the legislators and demanded more money and wages for people. This was back in the 80s. We didn't just go to school. I was student government president. We fought for a voting precinct on campus so that our students could change who sat in the offices in our particular county. We demanded that at that school that a student sit on the trustee board of the school as a voting member, and could raise serious questions about who would lead the school and how they would lead the school. And so there is no place in our history where you have not seen the work of HBCUs. What I would like to expand on also, though, is that our people have been at the forefront of what I call fusion politics. Every reconstruction movement in this country has been when people have found one another, white people and black people, white people, black people, brown people, Jewish people, Christians, Muslims, have found each other in a moral community. It was black and white legislators after the Civil War that turned this country around, went into the United States Congress, and where they had majorities, they won. Where they didn't have majorities, they built coalitions. And that's how we got the 14th and 15th Amendment of the Constitution and the Civil Rights Act of 1875. When you look at the Civil Rights Movement, Thurgood Marshall, black college graduate, but he went into that Supreme Court with white lawyers and Jewish lawyers and women lawyers at that time and beat an all-white Supreme Court with at least one member that was a former head of the Ku Klux Klan. When you look at the march from Selma to Montgomery, and even in Montgomery, when you look at, people forget that Rosa Parks was sent to Highlander by two white ladies there. And that Dr. King had one white minister that was one of his friends. And in Selma, the Jewish synagogue, we don't often talk about it, was a major player. So fusion coalitions is so critical. And that's what we focus on in the Poor People's Campaign. Like Dr. Moss, I'm a pastor. And I want to say, too, that people have to look at it and not say, well, in order to do what Dr. Moss has done and do that model, you have to have 10,000 members. No, I'm in a southern town, 500, 600 members. We've built 60 single-family homes for poor, low-wealth people, a senior citizen complex where no poor person spends over 15% of their income. They make $100 a month. They spend $15 for rent. We have a community garden. We have a HIV testing program, community program, a community computer program and training. We're building now a culinary arts restaurant for persons coming out of incarceration to get trained. And I could go on down the list. The question is, how do you see theology? How do you see God? And how do you see your place in God's work in this moment? Bishop Tutu once asked the question of us at Duke, who will join God? That God is saying, who will join me in the work of liberation? Now, in the Poor People's Campaign, that we take it the next step. And we say, as much as we do out of our churches, and as much as we do in our communities, We have to have fundamental transformation. Right now, for instance, in this country, we lose $1 trillion every year because of child poverty. We lose $2.6 trillion to gender and racial wage gaps. We lost $1.3 trillion in the government revenue by lowering the corporate tax rates. One of the reasons this pandemic has been so hard is because it has exposed the fissures of systemic racism and those disparities and systemic poverty. We lost $6.4 trillion in 2 endless decades of war, And so there has to also be like Isaiah said in Isaiah chapter 10, woe unto those who legislate evil and rob the poor of their rights and make children their prey. Or Jesus, when he said, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach good news to the poor. And that word in Greek is protokos, and it means those who have been made beggars by an oppressive system, that we have to be liberated to challenge those systems. So in the Poor People's Campaign, we go into communities, say like Mississippi, and we build Fusion Coalition. Or we go to Kentucky, a place called Harlan County, and we bring people, black folk from the hood in Louisville to the hollows of the mountains. And we've been able to forge relationships there around an agenda, and not by bypassing race, actually by dealing with race. In fact, in Harlan County, one day I put a map up and I showed all of the politicians that benefit from racialized voter suppression in Kentucky. And then I showed all of the politicians that vote against minors having unions and having decent health care and living wages. And it proved that they were the same one. And one of the guys, he was actually Dr. Moss, he was a McCoy, like the Hatfields and the McCoy. He said, Pastor, do that again. And I did it. He said, well, they are playing us against each other. I said, now what are you going to do about it? And they started organizing these 3 predominantly white so-called red counties. And last year, in 2018, they organized in 5, they turned 3 of them, put a new governor in place. The first thing that governor does, he guaranteed health care back to them. He put reinstored unions, and he passed a bill ending felony disenfranchisement. But it happened when we had black and white and brown come together. But you cannot reduce race. The same thing you heard Dr. Moss talk about here, we teach that even in the mountains of Appalachia, even in the farmlands of Kenya. And then we add to it the connectors to poverty and ecological devastation, healthcare. And in that process, we're able to find what I call a remnant. Now, here's where I'll stop with this. Right now, we put out a 14-point priorities to heal the nation, because everybody's saying we got to heal the soul of the nation, but you can't heal the soul of the nation if the body is sick. And if the body is sick with racism, sick with poverty, you have to heal it. So what we've done is said, here are 14 things. 1, you've got to enact comprehensive, just COVID relief that lifts from the bottom. 2, you've got to guarantee health care for all, regardless of any pre-existing condition. 3, you've got to raise the minimum wage of $15 an hour. 4, you have to update the poverty measure. 5, you got to guarantee quality housing for all. 6, you have to enact a federal jobs program to build investments, infrastructure, public institutions in poor and low income communities. 7, you got to protect and expand voting rights. 8, you got to guarantee safe, quality, equitable education. 9, you got to have comprehensive and just immigration reform. 10, you got to ensure all the rights of indigenous people. 11, you have to enact fair taxes. And 12, you have to redirect some of this military budget to deal with the issues of racial and class disparities. Now, people say, well, how does that address every one of those issues? We disaggregate how, if these policies happen, how it's going to help black people, how it's going to help brown people, how it's going to help indigenous people, how it's going to lift Asian people, and even how it's going to help poor and low wealth white people. Because what we found, lastly, is right now in this country, poor people represent nearly 1/3 of the elected. Poor people. That's 65,000 votes. Now, in the last election, 2016, only 26 million of them voted. In this election, 35 million poor and low wealth people voted. 6 million more, 29 million voted in 2016. 35 million this time, that's 6 million more. Now here's a stat we don't talk about. That black people, for instance, in Georgia and even in North Carolina, where we held on to a governorship, were the lead in making things happen. But the disaggregation shows that 55% of poor and low wealth people voted for Biden and Harris. In Georgia, it's 14% higher. You hear what I'm saying now? That means that poor and low wealth white people, when you look at the data, they're not the ones that are voting for regressive policy. It's what our data shows is whites making 70,000 and above. Remember that group that sows the division. But you can, a lot of poor and low wealth whites don't even vote. But if you come along with an agenda that deals with race, class, and ecological, you can move a remnant, enough of them. In 15 states, all you need is between 1 and 19%, Georgia is one of them, of poor and low wealth voters that didn't vote in 2016 to start voting, and they can decide who's in the presidential race and who wins the president, who wins the Senate. That's why Dr. King was shocked, because he had figured out that, and he was organizing around that. And he recognized that you don't have to back up on the race issue. In fact, you can press into it, and you can ultimately show that these are interlocking injustices. And guess what? When Dr. Moss mentioned Benjamin Rebellion, that's why they had to start, because when those black and white people organized against people, they said, we have to find a way to make this fusion never be possible. Or we know what we'll do. Let's create race. Let's create race. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Let me ask this. That's so important. First, let me thank Mr. Ramirez for your powerful question. So thank you so much for that, brother. We appreciate you. And of course, I echo what Dr. Moss said in terms of the, I'll just say the best college in the world, but thanks for going there. Let me ask this, and this is just kind of a conversation among us as we proceed to closing, and I appreciate what Mr. Ramirez was asking, in terms of where do we go from here? Of course, where do we go from here? Chaos or community? We've seen so much over the last several years, but we know that really is a symptom of an underlying white supremacy that we have also seen come to head as recently as the storming of the Capitol, where we have white extremists and racists and supremacists storming the Capitol because they did not get their way. And what strikes me is you have a horned, I dare say, hooved person in the chair of the Senate having the audacity to pray in the name of Jesus Christ, pray for the progress of the ills that they are pushing, in my estimation. Again, my question is, we've seen so much. So in Georgia, we see Ossoff and we see Warnock. We see, of course, Stacey Abrams in her tremendous work with Fair Fight. So we see these gains, but how do we have the strength to love and to find those fusion coalitions and proceed in the way of righteousness and a moral center when we see so much heaviness in front of us? We have 400,000, looking like 500,000 people who are dying of COVID. We look at these marginalized communities. We see people visit hate on us. How do we have that strength to love so that not only the agendas or the body is able to be repaired and lifted up, but also the soul as well? How do we do these things? Where do we go from here is the question that Mr. Ramirez asked us, but I compound that with, how is it that we maintain this strength to love? How do we do it in a very practical sense? Do we just fake it till we make it? Do we ascribe to the agenda until we kind of see this moral center and proceed? And that's to all of you all on here.
What we're seeing in the Poor People's Campaign and all kinds of grassroots organizing across the country is that people of all ages, of all races, of all nationalities, from all different kinds of places are coming together, are coming forward and saying, let's organize. Let's bring about a moral revival in this land. And I think we saw this in the 2020 election, where record numbers, especially of poor and low income people, turned out and were the deciding factor in elections, down ticket and all the way to the presidential office. I think we saw this in Georgia, especially in the runoff, right? Again, record turnout, including of poor, Black, Latino, and white people who voted for candidates that said, we're going to raise the wage. We're going to make sure that we have a just stimulus. We're going to make sure that there's health care for everybody. And I think that what we have to do is keep on going in that direction. We need a bold, visionary policy platform, and we need engaged and organized people in our communities across the country who are saying we need this. It's a matter of life and death, and we can do this.
Well, let me offer one little quick piece on this. I think, let me reverse the question. How do we not love? If we know that love and justice are connected, if we know that we've seen 400,000 people die, my daughter's a public health PhD, and she said 60% of them didn't have to die. If we know that 250,000 people were dying a year from poverty, 700 a day, even before COVID, if we know that every regressive piece of public policy has a DM on the DL, a death measurement on the down low, every piece. We talk about the number of people that get killed by police, and we should, and it's raw, it's rugged, it's radical, it's horrendous, it's horrible. But we also can't take our eyes off of the number of our people that die from bad public policy. How many Black people die from the lack of wages? So the question for me is the reverse. How can we not love? How can we not reach out to build these fusion coalitions? How can we see what we've seen? How can we see people dying, losing their breath, and we not make a decision that with every breath we have left, we're going to fight for a more loving and just society? How can we not hold our country to its own promise, where it said there's no way to get to domestic tranquility without the establishment of justice? It's the establishment of justice that comes first, that leads to the tranquility. How can we not love when our deepest moral and religious values tell us love, truth, and justice, mercy, and grace are held together? And lastly, how can we not do it when what we see in front of us, what we saw at the Capitol, that's just mob violence that got to the Capitol. It's not new. It's inevitably what has happened, what will happen anytime you sow race, class division, and fill it with ideas of white supremacy. But here's the last question. I'll leave the rest time to others. How can we not do what Dr. Moss said, have a little bit of prophetic imagination and ask this question? Could the pain that we're seeing, could they not be death pangs, Pangs, but birth pangs? They're death pangs, and then they're birth pains. And I have lived, to get through this, I have lived with Frederick Douglass in the spirit this year. And I've lived with one sermon he gave after the Dred Scott decision. And it was a horrible decision. Black folk have no rights, Dr. Moss, that a white man ever has to. And everybody was saying, it's over, the abolition movement is over, it's through. And they asked him to speak. And Frederick Douglass spent about 30 minutes laying out how monstrous it was. And then he says this, but I see this decision and receive it with a cheerful spirit. I said, Frederick, are you crazy? Spirit said, keep reading. He said, the truth is, maybe these things we are seeing are the necessary links in the chain of event to the downfall of the whole system of slavery. Therefore, this moment, we must know that every attempt to ally and stop the abolition movement has only served to intensify and embolden our agitation. This moment asks the question, how can we not love? How can we not speak truth? How can we not build alliances with Black, white, brown, indigenous people? How can we not find that remnant? Or as that young sister said, enough of us. Not everybody, but enough of us that say we can't stay here.
I would add,
Thank you.
it is,
Yeah, please help.
I would add that because what you raised, Dr. Rice, is a spiritual question in a material world. And the more materialism, we end up shrinking our ability to tap into the spirituality that allows us to be transformative and transform in this nation. So two great philosophers, one by the name of Albert Camus and the other by the name of Sojourner Truth. Camus speaks of the fact that we place and give meaning to when we are witnessing the absurd, and racism is absurd. Sojourner Truth, who was abused, and her name, Sojourner in Truth, according to her biography, was given to her by God. I witness horror. In other words, I have the strength because I have the spiritual resources to look at my blues, to face tragedy, and not succumb to despair. And what we must do in this age is develop the spiritual resources, because we can change policy, and we must. We can shift the economic outcomes, and we should. But if we do not have the spiritual rooting, meaning that we don't have love and justice and compassion and all the necessary resources that allow us to flourish, we will then become imitators or copies of that which we despise. Audre Lorde says it this way: you cannot build a new house from the master's tools. And we don't want to do that. So there is a necessity for us to develop those spiritual pieces. And so I raised a question in a sermon not too long ago, and someone raised that question in a conversation. I said, it's amazing that we talk about despair in 2021, but Harriet Tubman never raised the question when she was facing a horror that we have never seen. She says that I have to, because this is my calling. I can't see it, but my imagination plus spiritual depth and practical steps of living out to shift the world allows me to plant beautiful things in the midst of horror. And I'll end with this with Howard Thurman. Start with Howard Thurman, end with Howard Thurman, since he's a Morehouse grad. Howard Thurman, when he was about, I believe, 8 or 10, noticed that there was an elder who was planting pecan or pecan trees. Depending upon what part of the country you're from, it's pecan or pecan. And he said to this elder, who was probably about 90 years old, "Why are you planting these trees, sir? You will not live long enough to eat the fruit from the tree." The elder reared back, looked at young Thurman, and said, "Son, all my life I've been eating from trees I did not plant. It's my responsibility to plant for another generation so they may eat and have shade." So in 2021, we will plant trees. Fruit will come from it. We will never taste. Shade will be produced by it. We will never have the opportunity to receive, but we plant anyway. When you have the necessary spiritual resources, you then can face the blues, not fall into despair, and then merge your blue note moment to the possible good news that will come in the future as you continue to work toward freedom.
Wow, I know that's right. Well, I want to. We're close to closing time. One of the things that I do want to do is ask Dr. Barber if you have a minute or so to share with us, perhaps parting words. Dr. Moss has shared his, and then I'll close us out by thanking you and just saying again how tremendous it is to have spent time with you. So, Dr. Barber, do you have a few words to close us out, a minute or so?
Yeah, just very, very quickly, Dr. Moss said something that triggered a thought in my mind. You know, one of the great joys, and this might sound strange, of traveling and crisscrossing this country and being among the poor, whether it's walking in the Rio Grande River with a family that was torn apart by separation, immigration, or being in Appalachia, or being down in deep, deep Mississippi, or being even up in Massachusetts in some poor areas, or in the Tenderloin of San Francisco, is I'm amazed at how the agency of poor and low wealth people and how they teach us to keep hoping and keep loving. I had to criticize myself and say, how can I be hateful when these people are not hateful? They do dislike the system, but they still love humanity and believe in the possibility. And so I just want to say that you're exactly right. We learn spirituality in strange places. The last thing I want to say is, during this time of COVID, people have lost their breath. And one of the things we have to deal with is in 7 days, any of us could be losing our breath. We could be dead. And I asked the question this year, why am I still alive? Why are so many of us, in spite of all the deaths? Because it's all around us. And I thought about how do we honor those who are no longer breathing? And maybe the way we honor them is by saying every breath matters. And we don't have one breath to waste on racism and hate and destruction. But whether we live 7 minutes, 7 years, or 70 years, we ought to use every breath we have to seek to breathe hope, trust, love, and justice into this society and into this world.
And with that, I want to thank you all for your time spent with us. I appreciate you. I love you. I do want to say this. I always take personal privileges, it seems, at the end of these conversations. But Dr. Moss, of course, was the SGA president his senior year when I was a freshman in college. And when you were talking about in terms of this West African tradition of spirituality and not proselytizing, but in being God's love, you have so evinced that for these many years. And Dr. Barber, you as well, this idea of you all being God's love and being the change that we need. I so appreciate, and we so appreciate that. So thank you for your time with us and for teaching us. And thank you for God's grace.
Thank you.
I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us this evening. It's been a very insightful and inspiring conversation. I'm reminded of the words of Dr. King as we close, that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We're caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. So let us go forth, let us move forward together in our communities and face the challenge of change. We'll leave you with a video that was produced for the Morehouse King Collection for the 150th anniversary of the college several years ago. Thank you again for joining us.
Profiles of Courage, celebrating the Morehouse legacy of civil and human rights.
We can never be satisfied as long as our children are stripped of their selfhood and robbed of their dignity by signs stating for whites only.
The battle for civil rights in the South was hard fought by brilliant leaders who made back-breaking sacrifices in the name of equality. Leaders who understood that the stage was set and the time was now. Some would hail from Atlanta's Morehouse College, encouraged and inspired by the early years of the historic presidency of Dr. Benjamin E. Mays. Former Georgia Senator Leroy Johnson remembers the Tuesday talks.
His subject was the evil of segregation. And he said that Morehouse men must never pay for segregation.
Reaffirming messages of hope, telling the men, you have the ability, now apply yourself. Words that would give birth to a fearless, determined generation, one that would reshape Atlanta's history, the Atlanta Student Movement. Inspired by the Greensboro, North Carolina student sit-ins, Lonnie King recalls a conversation with Julian Bond in 1960.
Don't you think we ought to do something about it here? He said, well, somebody probably will. I said, let us make something happen, Julian.
Spearheaded by King, the newly formed Committee on the Appeal for Human Rights set up strategy meetings. Not long after the North Carolina sit-in, Georgia's legislature passed a law making it a misdemeanor to refuse to leave a place of business when ordered by management. Unmoved, King met with college presidents along with student leaders from each of the 6 historically black colleges and universities. It was suggested that grievances be listed formally.
I then appointed Rosalind Pope, who was the president of Spelman's SGA, who was a brilliant English major. I said, write the appeal for us.
The document addressed education, the lack of hospitals and police, and rules that force black patrons of the Fox Theater to pay at the front, walk around to the back, to climb 50 steps to the balcony.
My thinking was that human rights supersede civil rights, and that the reason we had to have civil rights was because we were not considered human. And so the idea was that as people, as human beings, we were deprived of things that other people had access to. And so it was more about our humanity than about whether or not we could get a hot dog.
The document was run as a full-page ad in area newspapers and nationally in the New York Times. Many students throughout the Atlanta University Center would galvanize into action. Multiple demonstrations would follow. They were deliberate and relentless, including one at Rich's department store.
We felt that if we break the Rich's department store, the rest of the town merchants will fall, like dominoes.
Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest far right.
Understanding his significance to the struggle and desiring his leadership, fellow Morehouse man Dr. Martin Luther King was called upon to take part. He, along with the group, would be arrested. But in 1961, Rich's, along with many other department stores and restaurants, ended the formal practice of segregation through a formal signed agreement. Another battle won in the war for civil rights. Leaders attributing their success to Dr. Benjamin Mays and the education that only Morehouse College could provide.
I can't describe to you what it was like adequately to be in the presence of Benjamin E. Mays.
Dr. Mays was providing the rhetorical and philosophical and the inspirational basis for who I became.
I'm always going to be grateful for what the Morehouse experience gave me.
I did not come here to practice my profession. I feel that I was summoned here. Being here was a calling.
Morehouse just isn't an ordinary school. Morehouse is an extraordinary school.